And so I'd like to start by welcoming all of you and thanking all of you for taking a bit of time on what I'm sure is a busy schedule to come to this very exciting event about digital media in the age of the cloud. I'm just going to very briefly introduce our moderator, and then he is going to in turn introduce the panelists, and we'll get going. So we're fortunate today to have Richard Wolpert, who's moderating the panel. He's with Amplify LA, which is a very interesting startup accelerator, I guess we can call it. And here in Venice, and Richard is also an angel investor on his own, and is also works with Accel Ventures, I believe, is for doing kind of more traditional technology venture capital. So I'll hand it over to Richard.
Thank you, John. Is this on? Can you guys hear me? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So just a little bit more about myself and then how we'll be doing this today. My career has spanned from Apple to startup to Adobe to Disney to real networks and now into venture. So I've had a really interesting run for 25-ish years in the mix of tech and media, and seen a lot of what's happened with innovation and content and other things. So hopefully I'll be well versed for today's panel. We're very sort of legal heavy on the panel today, so we so we will be talking some about policy, but I'm also going to get into specific trends and activities that are happening right now and try and get perspective from the different panelists on that. I was told to give a little bit of a briefing on what is cloud computing, and it's such a broad category that's hard to do in a minute or two. But just to give you a couple of examples, 10 years ago, when an internet company wanted to start up, one of their biggest expenses was buying servers and hard disks and getting storage and CPU utilization up and running in data centers. And that's completely been revolutionized by cloud computing. Amazon in particular is sort of famous for what they call Amazon Web Services, where you can buy all of that stuff that used to cost millions of dollars in initial startup fees for very, very inexpensive amounts, and get a company up and running now for a couple $100,000, where 10 years ago it took $3 to $4 million. On the consumer side, an example of cloud is we've moved away from having everything stored on our local hard drive, and we've been able to put things in cloud accounts or remotely hosted storage. Probably the most successful company in that space is a company called Dropbox, which maybe many of you use. And when you put something in Dropbox, it's actually stored on their servers in the cloud, and then you can access that from any computer or any device for that matter. So that's just a little bit of a primer on cloud. We'll get into more specific, interesting questions about specific services that utilize cloud technology. What I'd like to do to start is just have each of the panelists introduce themselves and do a 2 or 3 minutes on your background and what you spend your time focusing on at your company. So we'll start just here and move down the road.
Thanks, Richard. I'm Jewel Sigel. I'm Assistant General Counsel for IP Policy at Microsoft. I've been at Microsoft for almost 7 years. Before then, I was Associate Register for Policy and International Affairs at the U.S. Copyright Office. And before that, I practiced law at Arnold & Porter in Washington, D.C. I've spent a lot of time looking at mostly copyright, but general IP issues and technology. And for Microsoft, I spend most of my time thinking about IP policy issues, whether they be in the patent space or the copyright space or other types of IP. And both from the perspective of externally facing policy debates, but also internal questions from the company and the developers and the engineers and the business people who are building products and services, what they can and can't do, what they should and shouldn't do in building those products and services relative to patent, copyright law, and other IP disciplines. And of course, as you might expect, Microsoft has cloud services. We make devices, we make software, we sell software, we license it. We do almost everything you can do in this space. So the issues that Richard mentioned in terms of the business models, the trends are all things that we watch very closely, both from a legal perspective and from a business competitive perspective.
Hey, Joel, thank you. Dean?
My name is Dean Marks, and can you folks hear me? Because I turned off the mic. Oh, wait. I think I'm going to get a buzz, but let's try. Is this any better?
Yes.
Okay. All right, thanks. And I'm with Warner Brothers. I've actually been with Warner Brothers of Time Warner, just shy of 25 years, and my focus is on copyright law on the distribution side, so on our licensing of our works to various different platforms for distribution, the sorts of content protection and digital rights management technologies that we both use and develop and require of our distributors. And then I do a lot of work in the public policy space as well, like Jewel, both in the US and in Europe on evolving copyright laws, litigation, and policy.
Okay, Katie?
Great. Hi, my name is Katie Oyama. I'm a senior policy counsel at Google. I live in Washington, D.C. I primarily focus on copyright and trademark and some creativity policy. So I think similar to some of the folks that went before me, that includes both internal work, working with various Google products on what would our policies be, in addition to external work. So being in Washington, potentially reviewing legislation or working with partners and having some external conversations, kind of on weighing in on Google's perspective on some of these policy issues. Before I joined Google about 2.5 years ago, I spent a couple years in the Obama administration working for Vice President Biden as an associate and a deputy counsel. And then prior to that, I was also in Washington at WilmerHale, where I worked on IP litigation, and again, copyright, trademark, and then some patents.
Okay, Betsy?
Perhaps I am at fault for this feedback. I'm Betsy Rosenblatt. I am the head of the Center for Intellectual Property Law at Whittier Law School, which means I'm a professor. I just get to think about big issues and don't have to do them. But before becoming a professor, I worked for 9 years at Irell & Manella, a law firm in Century City. And in addition to teaching, I am chair of legal for the Organization for Transformative Works, which focuses on user-generated content and transformative works, particularly by fans for fans in the non-commercial context. And my scholarship as a professor focuses on transformative works and on areas of creation and innovation that thrive in the absence of formal intellectual property protection.
Okay, great, thank you. And one thing I just wanted to add is I'm a UCLA graduate, alumni, math computer science from 1984. I love the school. I'm on the board at the film school. I'm part of the UCLA VC fund. And I also am an advisor to Startup UCLA, which is a summer competition that happens. Before we get into the questions, I wanted to just ask real quick so we get a sense in the audience. How many of you are students? Great. And how many of you are attorneys? Okay, a pretty good amount. And how many are you with startup companies? Okay, so a few of those. Okay, great. So I'm going to start sort of very broad to give each of the panelists an opportunity to give their perspective on where we're at. And then I'm going to move into very detailed and real-time situations that are occurring right now. And my first question, open to anybody, is current copyright law well equipped to handle the existence of cloud computing? And if you do think it is, why? And if you don't think it is, why not? So any takers on that?
Well, I'll take a stab at it. And I want to start a little bit by sort of framing what I think of as cloud computing and what it does. Sure. So for me, cloud computing is, as much as anything, a question of how long the wire is or where the long wire is. We've had storage for a long time on a personal level, and even remote storage for a long time. The cloud computing revolution is, I think, mostly a difference of degree rather than a difference of type, but it's a very big difference of degree, where the long wire has moved from being inside one's business or home to outside one's business or home. So that accomplishes a few things. It makes it easier for people to store larger amounts, especially those with limited resources, startups, individuals, and it permits routine storage of more complex data, like audiovisual works. And it permits multiple people to have access to the same data, or it makes it easier for multiple people to have access to the same data instantaneously. So this is good or bad for creation and creators in various ways, which I hope we can get into more thoroughly. But I'd say that what it requires of the law is not much new. It's a scaling up, but it's also a question of making analogies. Once you move from analog to digital transmission of information, you have to start making analogies. And it gets harder to make those analogies between analog and digital when technology doesn't do what analog technology used to do. We've seen a few cases in recent years, particularly the Cablevision case, which I think we might talk about a little bit later.
We will.
Making that analogy, sort of pretending that that digital data is like paper data, at I think the expense of a little bit of technological precision, but perhaps that's a benefit. You can, by making analogies, apply old law to new situations. So I'd say that for the most part, old copyright law is equipped, but it requires some creativity.
Okay.
I would agree with that. I think, first of all, as an entertainment company, representing an entertainment company and Warner Brothers in particular, we're really excited about the cloud, and we've been licensing our content to various cloud services since 2007, whether it's Amazon or Microsoft or Apple, and we're a founder of Ultraviolet, and I hope we'll get to talk about Ultraviolet a little bit later in the panel, because for audiovisual works, the great thing about the cloud for us is that it provides a legitimate means for a consumer, if they buy a copy of our movie, to be able to store it in the cloud, access it on a whole variety of different devices. So it doesn't, you don't have to have a device that has an optical media drive. You can have a device that just has an internet connection and be able to download a copy or stream a copy, share it with a limited number of people, your family, your friends, up to a limited number of account holders. So for us, this is a great added value in terms of content distribution. I totally agree with Betsy that I think copyright law is basically well equipped to deal with some of the challenges of the cloud, as long as the analogies that are made are the proper ones. I think right now, US law is in a little bit of state of flux, where there have been some decisions made, for example, in a case called the Aereo case, where a service has set up all these tiny little mini antennas to capture television broadcast signals and then sends them off to subscribers. And two courts have said, well, each of those is actually a private performance and it doesn't implicate copyright law, even though what you're having is, the broadcast of a Super Bowl sent to 50,000 or 100,000 or 1 million subscribers, which if a cable service or a satellite service was doing that, they clearly need a retransmission license. So there are some areas that I think where the interpretation needs to be a little bit updated. But I think the concepts of making copies, sending things is well covered by copyright law. And I think the thing that content companies are concerned about with the cloud, it's not individuals storing their stuff in the cloud for their individual use. It's what Betsy was referring to about the cloud also allowing multiple people to access content that's in the cloud, to which they may not actually really have the rights to do it if it's copyrighted content. So that's sort of, if you will, I think the point of friction with cloud computing today.
Okay. Katie or Jill, do you want to add anything?
Well, I generally agree that copyright laws in the U.S. anyway, as currently constructed, is capable of dealing with the issues presented by the cloud. But I do think there's a potential real issue about how it is perceived by the public when it comes to dealing with questions of the cloud. And I start these remarks with the premise of my current sort of conception of the cloud as it's most relevant to copyright. My current conception of the cloud as it's most relevant to copyright is your mobile phone, your tablet, your devices. That is the cloud that I think that's most relevant to copyrighted content. And we don't usually think of it that way because those are devices. Those are not the large data centers that Amazon or Microsoft or Google is running to help startups build web services or other things. That's what we sort of think of as the cloud. But I think of the cloud for copyright purposes as the much more personal embodiment that you find in your phone and your tablet. And then when you start there, I think the cloud is more personal than you might think. And I also think it's more decentralized than you might think. And the reason it's important for copyright and whether copyright is sort of viable and useful in going forward in dealing with these issues is that those devices are personal to people. What they do with them is very personal and important to them. And what they do with them is seen in their eyes as communication rather than something else, and more integral to the way they communicate with their friends and their family. So the question, I think, that the sort of dormant question in the copyright law as it applies to the cloud is, will copyright law be seen by those people, and by those people I mean basically everyone, right? Almost everyone, almost regardless of age now, has access to these devices and to the cloud services that keep them running and make them useful for them. Will copyright be seen as an enabler of that or an impediment to that? And a lot of times that boils down to the question of sort of personal use, personal copying, personal access. These are sort of familiar issues that those of us in the copyright field have dealt with for decades. But that question, I think that's sort of the up or down question on copyright, is the perception within the public of whether it's helping or whether it's hurting in those areas. And you know, if it helps and it makes services that the studios and other content producers, if they're seamless and people access their content and enjoy it easily, then it's an enabler. If it frustrates those consumers, then you'll have questions about whether copyright is doing the job it should be doing. And I think that's the kind of question we should be talking about. Where does that sort of personal consumer expectation around the cloud and content, where does that fall? And where does copyright land when you look at it in those terms? We can talk about more of this, but the software industry, of which Microsoft and others are part of, has been dealing with this sort of digital personal issue for a long time, for decades, almost 30 or 40 years, and has had different ways to deal with it, and continuing to have different ways to deal with how you deliver software as a creative product to people in the cloud and through the cloud and on these new devices. And there's lots of interesting things I think you could think about how that's done. I think the most important thing to remember is, what are those consumer expectations? How are they looking at this question? And are they looking at it? They're probably not looking at it in the same way that copyright geeks like those of us on the stage look at it. And there can be a real disconnect there. And I think that's what you're seeing playing out in some of these cases. And I think that's the issue to really sort of focus on, is how the consumer's expectations and desires to use these things to communicate are driving whether copyright is seen as a positive or a negative force in the space.
Yeah, I don't know if I feel good or bad about being referred to as a copyright geek, but that remains
to
to
be
be seen.
Can I make one remark on what Jules said, just very quickly?
Sure.
While I agree that, depending on the consumer perception of whether copyright is seen as an impediment to these services or a facilitator of these services may influence how kind of copyright law is seen and its utility and function. I think there's another side to it that's sort of not necessarily bound by the copyright law, which is, what are content creating, and whether it's software or entertainment content, businesses doing? Are they embracing the cloud, and are they giving consumers good value propositions such that the consumer says, God, I'm not going to try and go to Rapid Share to get a movie, because if I buy the DVD, I'm going to get a UV token anyway, and I'm going to be able to share it with 5 of my relatives, and that's a better proposition. It's going to be good quality, and it's going to have all the bonus content and all that stuff. I think that is a big driver, and so, for example, if you buy a movie and you put it in your and you put it in your locker and you can download it to multiple devices. You're making multiple copies. If that was not authorized, that would be a copyright infringement. But it is authorized because the businesses are embracing that sort of distribution model. So I think it's very important to not necessarily look at the law just in isolation, but look at what companies are doing with the law to try and meet legitimate consumer expectations.
I think that's exactly right, and I think from Google's perspective, one of the phenomenons that we're seeing kind of, especially in recent years, is the rise of these digital marketplaces and the rise of cloud services for the creation, the distribution, the monetization of content, and I think that's a very positive thing. Looking back at kind of first principles of copyright law, what are the primary goals of the law? It's to incentivize creativity. And so if you look at what are the new services enabling today, I think there is more creativity than ever before. There's the same professional classes of creators that are doing amazing things on the web. There's also kind of growing and emerging middle class of creators. It's really kind of widened and diversified the body of folks that are creating music and movies and text, and giving them really compelling and affordable ways to create something, upload it, and distribute it to a wide audience. I think the way the U.S. law is constructed as a general matter is doing fairly well in terms of encouraging these kind of services. So for a company like ours, when we're looking at how the U.S. legal framework exists compared potentially to other countries, the way in which the U.S. law has basically enabled the internet economy to survive here is pretty important. So we have both the exclusive rights within copyright for rights holders, coupled with very important exceptions, limitations, things like fair use or safe harbors for platforms that enable this kind of sharing and creativity. One of the products I think that we're really excited about at Google, which is actually one of our newer products, is Google Play. So that's a cloud-based service for premium content. We have partnerships with all the major labels, the major studios, and that allows. It's in many ways I think a win-win-win. It allows users to access content, so kind of in real time. You can purchase a song on your phone, and because it's stored in the cloud, you can later access it from your tablet or from your computer. You can buy it on your desktop, and then when you're out jogging, you can access it from a different device, from your mobile device. So that's tremendously exciting, and that covers many different verticals. So that could cover, film and movies, books. It's the largest collection of ebooks. So, like for example, textbooks. Like I think we're on a campus. Probably many of us are still lugging around textbooks, but the ability to be able to access your textbook into the cloud, to either rent or purchase, makes a big difference. Not just to the weight that you're carrying, but also to ease of access. For songs, to be able to access like 18 million different songs or your personal collection, as well as learn about new music, because it's stored in a central place, is pretty exciting. I think for creators that want to share their content, and also for users who basically want easy access to great music and movies and books, and also is very exciting for the platforms. And because of that breathing space that the U.S. law has, with the exceptions and limitations, I think that's why you're seeing many of these successful cloud-based models emerge in America versus other countries that are not quite so balanced in their frameworks.
Okay, so one of the things that's been brought up a couple times already is ultraviolet, and Dean actually used UV token. So I wanted to explain a little bit what ultraviolet is, and then I have a question for the panel. So the studios all recognized several years ago that consumers were going to have the desire to take a DVD that they bought and make a copy of that DVD for their PC and for their other devices. And to try and come up with a solution for that, all the studios got together and came up with the technology that they all agree on called ultraviolet, which is a secure way of making a copy of a DVD if you get those rights when you buy the DVD. When you see TV commercials for movies now, they often say, buy the Blu-ray combo pack. And basically what that means is you're getting the Blu-ray disc, the regular DVD disc, and then a disc for ultraviolet that allows you to upload to the cloud. But Dean, first for you, I feel like the average consumer still has never heard of ultraviolet. and the actual consumer experience for getting ultraviolet stuff into the cloud is different depending on which studio you bought the content from. So I question whether the studios are doing a good enough job in providing a solution to piracy, and how you take that perspective.
Yeah, well, right now, I mean, the actually ultraviolet, not all the studios are participating because Disney is not, but all the major studios other than Disney are participating, and the ultraviolet consortium is actually composed of more than 75 companies. So Microsoft's in it, Intel's in it, a lot of big tech companies and CE companies are involved, so it wasn't just the studios getting together.
Sure.
But the notion with ultraviolet is actually, as Warner's does it, we include it's really just a slip of paper. It's a coupon in your Blu-ray disc that has a code on it, an authorization code on it, and you go to your ultraviolet account, which takes about 5 minutes to open. I mean, you can do it on Vudu, you can do it on Flickster, you can do it on Cinema Now, you can do it at uv.com, and then you type in this token, and the movie automatically loads into your locker. And the nice thing about ultraviolet is your locker is your locker. You can associate it with Flickster, you can associate it with Vudu, you can associate it with Cinema Now, you can associate it with multiple services, or you can change services, but it's your locker. You're not tied to a single platform or a service provider. And then it allows you to stream the movies and download them to multiple devices and share them. And what we've also done is, I think pretty much almost well, I shouldn't say every movie we put out on DVD, but I think a lot of them now, we have a disc-to-digital services where you can take a DVD that never came with an ultraviolet token because it was issued beforehand, and pay a nominal fee. It's usually $1 or $2, and get a token into your locker. So I think, yes, we still need to do a better job promoting it. Yes, we'd like to see it roll out to more people, but I think we're reasonably pleased with the progress so far. And what is the most encouraging to us is that people who actively use the service, from the surveys we've done, really, really like it. And it's amazing sometimes, like you'll say, like grandmothers who use the service and say, I love this because I buy these movies and now I can share them with my grandkids across the country because they're all on the same account. And so we're optimistic.
Okay. Anybody else want to add to that?
Well, I have a thought on that, which is that services like that are fantastic if what you want to do with your content is consume it. And if that's all you want to do with your content. And this is a sort of broader, I think, question with the cloud in general, is that it gives an awful lot of power to intermediaries, to the cloud services themselves, the people who own the server. It's not necessarily a bad thing for most people, and in fact, it's often a very good thing, because if you, right, I don't know about you guys, but I have a foot locker full of obsolete cassette tapes that I no longer have to have, right? So I go out and buy my content, it's all out there in the cloud, I can get it in a bunch of places, that's fantastic. What I can't do with material that's in the cloud is transform it and make my own expression using that, and I can't because it's restricted by the terms of use of those clouds. Whereas I can do that with old analog media. The fair use exception allows me to do that. The first sale exception allows me to do that. So it's a blessing and a curse in terms of incentivizing creation, as we're talking about. It allows us to buy more, which is a good incentive, but it inhibits the way we can create in some other ways.
Okay. Well, the next question I wanted to ask is, you have Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, companies like Tencent offering more and more free cloud storage to consumers. I think Tencent's offering a terabyte for free. Google and Microsoft, you can talk about how much you offer. But the question is, as that as that number gets bigger and bigger, don't you think there'll be an increasingly amount of pirated content that users are putting into their cloud storage? And what, if any, protection or methods can a company like Google or Microsoft take to help protect content owners when there's really just this vast storage that allows a consumer to put whatever they want on the storage itself?
Well, let me start to explain how this issue has gotten more complicated over the past 2 or 3 years than it was, 5 or 6 years ago in this respect. It's true. I think we have SkyDrive. Microsoft has SkyDrive, which I think offers the general plan as a 25 gigabytes of storage. If you went to my SkyDrive, you would see, I think, 5 to 6 gigabytes of video on my SkyDrive locker, and it's video. It's MP4 video. 5 years ago, if you saw that, you would think he's pirating movies, right? He's been ripping DVDs and putting stuff in there, because who would have that many gigabytes of storage? You actually looked at what it is every video I take with my phone gets sent to the SkyDrive automatically in high def. So it's all my kids' baseball games and all of that. So the sort of indicators of what people might be doing with these drives change over time, and it's more. And this is what I was sort of getting to in the point about consumer expectations. More and more people are loading these spaces up, not with infringing material, but very large files that are perfectly legitimate and content that they use. So the indicators that you might have had as to something doing something infringing are different, and we have to be careful, I think, about saying that certain things that you think look bad from the outside because of X, Y, and Z are in fact bad. I think the other important question is, and I think this gets to what Dean I think was referring to before, which is, and this is another area that might be interesting to think about copyright law and whether it's working or not, which is, what is the really bad act about these services? Is the really bad act about these services storing things for your own personal consumption, or is the really bad act making that stuff available to strangers for their consumption? This is sort of the private personal copying question has sort of been unanswered or answered in different ways by different laws for a long time, but it's going to become, I think, more important because more and more people are doing this storage in this cloud for their own personal use. And this is a good, if you want to get, for those of you who are law students or adjuncts or law professors, here's a good, I'll give you a free law school exam question. Because from a real example of what you do with this issue. We haven't gotten very many notices for takedown on services like SkyDrive, but some of the ones we do get are for news articles. There are services out there that on behalf of newspaper publishers look for full text versions of newspaper articles that people have stored in a SkyDrive locker and are making, and it's a shared folder, it's not a private folder, so their crawlers can find it and they can identify it, and they say, this is a full text copy, it's clearly infringing, take it down. Now, and I think most of those cases we inform the subscriber, and the subscriber takes it down, and it works out fine. But here's a hypothetical that I think is an interesting one, which presents the potential conflict we have here. What if I'm simply working on an article for college or for high school, or a paper, and I'm saving full text articles in my SkyDrive locker, which is personal, and I'm keeping all my research there. Then I have a colleague who's going to work, or a co-student, a student is going to work on this paper with me, and I want to make it accessible to them. I just open it up to the world because I know they're the only ones who are going to look at it. They're going to look at those articles. They're going to help put the PowerPoint presentation together or put something together, and it stays open. If we get a notice that says this person is sharing copyright infringing material, what exactly should we do to take that down? I mean, I think most people would agree that it's somewhat intrusive to force that person to delete all that research and say it has to be deleted from the service, right? I think the more practical and useful thing to do is just make that inaccessible to the public. Keep that as in their private copies. And the legal question of whether those copies are infringing or not, is a complicated one. And part of that complication makes copyright a little bit unpalatable to a lot of people when you explain it to them. But you have to recognize that the distinctions here are very important. And if the result of copyright is that people lose their research because they happen to store it on a cloud service, that's not a good result for copyright. It's not a good result for the user. It's, from our selfish perspective, it's not a great user experience, as our developers would say. But those are the kinds of things that I think sort of isolating the acts that are truly on the other side of the line on copyright versus the ones that are more reasonable and appropriate for everyone to be doing is something worth thinking about in terms of the copyright law and how it affects the cloud.
Katie, I'd love to hear.
Oh,
Sure.
sorry.
I mean, I think the ability to store large amounts of data is not really a brand new thing, right? Like we all know hard drives, you can store pretty much, unlimited music, movies, content. So that's not necessarily that different because you can now access it through the internet and use the cloud. I think one of the challenges that probably all of the companies have here is how do you meet consumers like in the market and meet their demand? How do you offer something compelling? How do you take a segment of users that does have a variety of choices of where they're going to go and access? And how do you direct users or consumers to the legitimate, legal services? And I mean, as lockers have existed, simultaneous with that, you're seeing huge growth in digital revenue from services. I think like the recording music industry said recently, more than 50% of their revenues are now coming from digital, and that's only expected to rise, like both domestically in the US and internationally. And if you think about, one of our examples would be with Play. There's, so you can access Google Play from the internet, from any web-based device, from an Android device. So there are 1 billion Android devices out there now. And if people are accessing, say, their personal content through the cloud, if you can also, through that same service, be introduced to new types of music that you didn't know before, or you can create something yourself and upload it on YouTube, and that goes viral, and it happens to have a song that the original rights holder would then also get compensated on from systems that we have in place. These are all kind of net wins for everybody. It's increasing sharing, increasing interactivity, and introducing users to new information. So I think a lot of this is figuring out what consumers are looking for and how to develop products and services that will be compelling to them.
Yeah, before you answer, Dean, I just wanted to add, one of the things that Jewel mentioned was takedown notices. So I just want to give a little bit of color on that, and then Dean, hand it off to you. But there was a law formed, 15 years ago, you guys would know better than I am, called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And essentially it allows for a method for content owners to notify an infringing party and have that content taken down. So if Warner Brothers notices that there's a movie up on YouTube, they can call YouTube and say, you have to take this down, and YouTube works with them and complies and takes that down. It's a very rough game for the content owners because there's new stuff getting put in storage all over the world on all kinds of devices. But I was wondering, Dean, you had something to say, but also to add, what, if any, proactive measures do you think companies like Google and Microsoft should take to help prevent the storage of pirated content?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd like to say I agree with both Jewel and Katie. I think from our perspective, what is troubling isn't so much the personal storage, it's content that is uploaded to publicly, either share folders or public folders or what have you, that are full-length copies of our movies or television shows and then are downloaded or streamed by tens of thousands of people. And so that's a problem for us. If somebody has taken, let's say, one of their DVDs and they've decided, I'm not going to do a disc-to-digital program, I'm just going to rip it myself and put it in my private cloud locker. First of all, we're never going to find it anyway, right? Because we can only find stuff that's on the cloud service because it's being linked to by indexing sites and linking sites and things like that. So I think, kind of irrespective, with all due respect, Jewel, of whether that personal copying is actually fair use or not fair use, I don't ever see it really getting litigated, because what we care about are the copies that are out there and available for anybody to download and stream. And so I think there are some pragmatic steps that cloud storage companies can take. Google, for example, has this great content fingerprint and filtering system for YouTube, where if a copyright owner gives Google a movie or a television program, Google will take a fingerprint of that, and then if somebody tries to upload that same content file onto YouTube, it will be blocked. We'd love to see that happen on Google Drive because we license to Google Play. Google Play is great. But on Google Drive, unfortunately, which is another Google cloud storage service, we're seeing lots of high quality copies of our content where on indexing sites you'll see a copy of one of our movies and it's got 70,000 views or 80,000 views. And yes, we can notify it and have it taken down, but if Google applied, for example, the Content ID filtering system, at least to folders that are shared folders or public folders, then that content wouldn't make it up there in the first place. So I think there's filtering. I think there are things like limiting the number of simultaneous streams that can happen from a share folder, potentially limiting the number of people who can go to a share folder, or if you're going to have a public share folder, have sort of more rigorous filters for the public share folders as opposed to the limited private folders. Have a really rigorous repeat infringer policy so that if, in fact, a content owner is notifying someone of, a drive or a cloud service saying, God, that this particular user just seems to be uploading movie after movie after movie, that the service will actually be able to terminate the user. I think it's those sorts of things that we would like to see put in place. And are those real copyright law remedies? I would say, no, those are best practices that content owners and cloud service providers should sit down together and work out together. And that's what I'd like to see happen.
Yeah, and I'd love, Katie, for you to respond
Sure.
to that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of prongs. There's DMCA notice and takedown. There's also tools like Content ID. I mean, I think for the takedown regime, one of the things we're actually seeing is automation really speeding up the efficiency of this process. So if you're a rights holder and you submit a notice, you're not going to court. You're actually, alerting the intermediary, hey, this is my content. I'm authorized. This person is not. I'd like it to be removed from your system. In terms of the stats that I'm aware of, across our products, in 2009, we got something like 69,000 takedown requests. And today we have, it's available publicly online, the Copyright Transparency Report. Every 30 days, we're getting more than 20 million notices in each 30-day period. So the amount of notices is increasing, and I think the use of these tools are increasing. But at the same time, the turnaround times have dropped drastically. So, I think there used to be a lot of conversations that used to take weeks or days, and by applying automation to these tools, we've got now, for the more than 20 million that are coming in every 30 days, they're getting removed on average in 6 hours or less. So that's a pretty fast, efficient, not going through a court process type of system. I think the other thing that we're seeing that's really interesting on something like Content ID, because you had mentioned notice and takedown, and I think the philosophy and the mentality there is always about blocking. And I think that was really relevant maybe even up until a few years ago. And even on Content ID for YouTube, the vast majority of people that use that tool, so if you're the rights holder and you're alerted before a user upload goes live, you're alerted, hey, there's a match to your content, what do you want to do? And you have 3 options. You can block it, you can monetize it, or you can kind of track it, so like various analytics. So the vast majority of our rights holder partners used to set to block because that was, I think probably a traditional approach to your content. You want to have kind of exclusive control over what's happening to it. So what's really interesting now is the vast majority of partners that are using those tools will now either set to monetize or will analyze. And that's pretty interesting, and it also is really helping increase the awareness of a lot of different types of content. So, like, especially in the music industry, we've seen in the last couple of years, a song will get introduced on YouTube, not super well known. Some user will find it, make some hilarious video, it goes viral. You've got 50,000 different versions of it, and because of this matching, the original rights holder, the original artist, can actually get a revenue stream. So the majority of the advertising revenue will go back to the content creators. So it requires a little bit of a shift in thinking from just taking things down to figuring out how does this become part of my business model, but is more and more on various platforms something that users are embracing, and I think opening up new markets to stakeholders and rights holders that never existed before and only exist now because of these cloud services.
So two things that have come up in this sort of last discussion that I think are interesting to think about. The first is this is the collaboration point that Jewel made earlier, that it's now easier than ever before to collaborate in real time using the cloud. And actually, this example was a perfect example. I have a research assistant who just recently has gone out and found a bunch of law review articles that will be very helpful for my research. She's put them in a Dropbox-like service, I don't remember the brand, and I can go read them based on her research. Now, in the past, she would have gone to a library, she would have found them, she would have photocopied them, and she would have put them in my inbox in the office, right? It's really not meaningfully different from a library. But when you start looking then at shared folders and public folders, what would have been possible in the library context and not challenged at all now starts to look suspiciously like what Dean's concerned about. Not entirely like it, but suspiciously like it. So one question is, how do we discourage or stop piracy without stopping things that are legitimate, important, fair uses, like research, like creative. We've seen some really interesting crowdsourced creativity lately that requires large-scale access to transform existing works. These are things that are pretty straightforward, non-commercial, fair use, but they require large-scale access. And then when we pair that with automation, which I agree lowers the price a good deal of policing for infringements, which are legitimate piracy-type infringements need to be policed. But we at the OTW have seen, at the Organization for Transformative Works, have seen a real rise in false positives. Bots are out there searching for copies of text works or video works. We, on our archive, only host text works, so we only are getting these for text works. But you find something that has maybe 10, 15 words in common with an existing text work, you get a takedown notice, and then you got a lot of explaining to do about how this is a quote for commentary or for creating a new narrative that a human being looking at it would say, this is great, this is exactly what we want our fans to be doing, but a machine can't do that. And with the speed of having things taken down, all of these things that were encouraging creativity pre-automation are now creating, as you would say, this perception that copyright law is getting in the way, rather than a perception that copyright law is helping. So one of my questions is, how do we make a difference, or how do the content owners who have important rights to defend distinguish between this sort of important, protected, collaborative creativity and piracy, one of which we want to really encourage because that's what copyright is supposed to do, and the other which we want to discourage because that's what copyright is supposed to do?
I'd actually like to speak to that because I think that's a really, really important question. And it's one of the things, I mean, this is just a personal thing with me, but that I am one of the most proud of with our company and with Warner Brothers. When Google first introduced the Content ID system for YouTube, it was not as flexible as it is today. And basically, if you submitted your fingerprints, if there was a simultaneous match of, I think it was around 30 seconds or 60 seconds, then that would kind of trigger the filter. And I think in the early days, it was only a block or no block. And we said, we're not going to use it because we're concerned that that's going to overblock, and it's going to overblock mashups, and it's going to overblock potential fair uses and fan uses. And we are every copyright owner is different, and I'm hardly speaking for all the studios, but at our studio, we have a very liberal policy towards fan uses and mashups and parodies and creative uses of our works, and we it's not just that we tolerate it. I mean, we like it. We like fans who say, here's our, favorite mashup of, these, Veronica Mars series or whatever it may be. And so I think content owners also have a responsibility to use these automated tools responsibly. And so we set, parameters of several minutes of simultaneous video and audio match before the filter will even kick in, because we want to make sure we give breathing room for those transformative uses. And so I think, there was a recent case of some music company in Australia that sent a notice to Larry Lessig, who had put a particular bit of a song in a lecture. I mean, as a copyright, as a representative of a content-owning company, you see that and it just makes you cringe, because that's not what we should be trying to stop. Clearly, sorry. It's about the wholesale taking of entire copies of our works and distributing without authorization. So.
Julia, you're chomping at the bit.
If I could just, I just want to add the perspective of Microsoft to a lot of what's been said, because there's potentially some sort of differences I think you see between the software industry and the content industry on this point. First of all, we are one of the most prolific notice filers in the world. I think we're a frequent flyer user of the Google service on search. Most of our online anti-piracy efforts are designed to take links to infringing copies of our products off of the major search engines, and we're very glad that Google is constantly improving those services. And on our own Bing search engine, we try to develop as many services as we can to help content owners file those notices quickly and get them taken down quickly. And I think most of our online anti-piracy efforts have been centered around notice and takedown, and working with all of the various search engines, cloud storage, other providers to get that takedown as quickly as possible for a couple reasons. We spend a lot of time making it effective and useful, and we're able to do that because of our resources, but that's the focus. But I think it also recognizes that while filtering may be great and may work well with YouTube, you have to remember that a consumer comes to YouTube with a different expectation when they're uploading a video. They're uploading that video so that everyone can see it. So they have an expectation that that video is going to be seen by a lot of people, and therefore they sort of understand that if they're going to use copyright material in there, that could potentially raise issues, because this is really a public broadcast. I would just caution that a consumer's expectations about what they're uploading to their private storage drive at a certain time is potentially very different from their expectation when it comes to something like YouTube. So the question of whether a filter stops them from doing that or not, for legitimate reasons, so from a copyright owner perspective or not, is going to be received very differently from that consumer. And I think it's not the case that Microsoft anyway, in our own anti-piracy efforts, are looking towards filtering mechanisms for these sort of storage facilities as a way to keep our products off that facility. And there could be lots of reasons why that's different between us and studios, but I think it's generally true among the software industry, other members of the industry that are trying to license and sell software. They too are not looking at filtering as an effective or useful means for keeping their infringing copies of their products off the cloud. What instead they're doing is just trying to transition the way that software is delivered. You see changes in the way that you deliver software. The Office suite of products that used to be licensed individually on a copy per copy basis is shifting over to a subscription model where the copies become somewhat irrelevant. You get pretty much as many copies as you want. There are limits, but they're functionally, for most people, as many as they want on any device. And so the necessity under that kind of model to actually take down the copies as they appear elsewhere becomes lessened. You devalue the benefit people receive from a pirate copy or a copy that's unauthorized. You've seen Adobe do that with a lot of their creative suite of products. They've shifted them to cloud-based models. And it's just a different approach, and it's part of what Dean said before about how you can look at the copyright law and look at these problems in that little bubble. You have to recognize that sits in a larger context of how you're trying to make creative stuff, whether it be software or audiovisual entertainment and deliver that to people in a way that they enjoy and want to come back and get more stuff from you, but in a way that also you can get compensated for that use. And so while it may work in some contexts, we have to be careful about it in other contexts, and I think it's the question Betsy was getting to is, how do we distinguish between the legitimate use and the illegitimate use? Probably not in litigation, as Dina said. This is not going to be fought out in court, although we can talk about the Aereo case where I think it is a little bit, but more in how how these services are launched and received, and how potentially, there's a policy discussion about how all services should be doing X or all services should be doing Y, because that would help with one aspect of the problem. That's where I think you're going to have a discussion about, does it go too far? Does it inhibit legitimate use and therefore sort of undermine and incentivize the evasion of those techniques because they're getting too much in the way of what people expect to do with these technologies.
Okay, I want to move on. Something that came up earlier was somebody mentioned the Cablevision case. And just to add some sort of historical perspective, back in I think it was the 70s, when VCRs were first released, a couple of the studios, I think it was Universal first and foremost, was suing Sony, who had released the Betamax, saying that users making a copy of a movie to a tape was infringing the copyright. And as that case came out, it was determined that it's fair use for a person to make a copy of something they bought to be able to play it on another device or to be able to store it. And it was really a landmark case that set the stage for fair use and personal copies going back, as I said, at this point, about 30 years. In the last 10 years, we've had a similar case that I think is a landmark case that's affecting a lot of services and what's available and what's not, and that's this Cablevision case. And what Cablevision did was they said, okay, everybody has a DVR when you get cable, and it's a hard disk stored in your box, in your set-top box. What Cablevision did is they actually moved that hard disk to the cloud and assigned a hard disk for each user of their set-top boxes and allow them to store copies of things that are broadcast, whether they're TVs or movies, into this cloud service. And it's effectively a DVR in the cloud. And it's a case that Cablevision won. And it sets the stage for a lot of things, including Aereo, which I want to come back to a little bit. But I'd love to just get the panel's perspective on, was that a good decision or not, and how that affects their current business and the way they're looking at offering different services.
Well, since my business isn't at stake, I think it was a great decision. I think it was a great decision because this is an example of what I think of as analogy making. One could say, and along the line some did say, that because this cloud service required making a copy, transitory as that copy might be, that copy is infringing, and we peg infringement to copying, end of story. I think the court, upon examining that holding, said, wait a second, this is really a question of where the long wire is. Is the long wire inside your home or is it outside your home? And so it relabeled this transitory copying as being very much like what happens in your brain when you read. When you make a copy on the back of your eye, is that a copy? Well, only metaphorically at most, right? So this is a question of making that analogy in a way that may not be precise according to technology, but is, I think, more precise as a matter of the way we use the technology. What I find interesting about that case, though, is it was about people who are already paying for the service. Right? It was about people who were using this exactly the way they use their DVRs at home, which is a well-established fair use under this Betamax case. Now, we can debate, I think, whether that case is good from a policy standpoint. I happen to think it is. Other people don't. But it follows in a straight line from that case. What's interesting to me is the Aereo case, which you mentioned, which isn't about people paying for the service in the same way. It's about circumventing that payment system, whereas Cablevision wasn't. So I think Cablevision is a great decision. It'll be interesting to see, and I think in terms of influence, Aereo will end up being, we're seeing this sort of evolution of the law. Cablevision was not from the United States Supreme Court, so it is not the law of the land. We may see the law of the land being made by Aereo.
So just to fill everybody in on Aereo, in case you're not familiar with it, they've taken the DVR in the cloud model and taken it one step further, and I would even say more aggressively. And their position is, and some of us have forgot, but you can actually receive HD signals to all the broadcast channels, CBS, ABC, NBC, Fox, and others, over the air if you have an HD antenna. And you don't need to pay for that. And it works just like it did 30 years ago before cable ever started. So what Aereo decided is, if you can put the DVR in the cloud, you can also put the HD antenna in the cloud. And they have a bundled service, which is an HD antenna and a DVR, and they charge, I think it's $8 a month for access to that. And you can get, unlimited broadcast of those channels and unlimited recording use of those channels if you're an Aereo subscriber. Now, Aereo is currently battling through the legal system. The entertainment industry, just to use the term broadly, has tried to shut Aereo down using temporary restraining orders. To Aereo's benefit, none of those TROs, temporary restraining orders, have actually been issued, and it's allowed Aereo to expand from their initial city, which was New York, now into about 20 cities. So you truly have a cloud cable provider, if you will, that's giving you access to all of the broadcast channels and a DVR. And there's a belief or a fear, and I'd love, Dean, for you to speak up here, that somebody can subscribe to Aereo and Netflix and Hulu, and it's $24, and they've got unlimited access to broadcast, TV, movies, DVRs, and they don't have to go through a traditional cable provider, and the retransmission fees that are normally paid for broadcast cable get circumvented. So I wanted to just expound a little bit on what Aereo is, because it's been referenced a couple times, but I'd love to hear the panel's take on the combination of the Cablevision case and the current state of the Aereo case.
Well, I'm happy to take a crack at it. I don't think it'll surprise anybody in the room that I think Aereo is a terrible decision, the court decisions that have been done so far, because really what's happening is if Aereo put up one antenna to capture the signal and then was retransmitting it over the internet to its subscribers, that would clearly be an unauthorized public performance, exactly what the cable and satellite companies do. And in fact, there's been a case in the same Second Circuit with a company that did that, where the court said, well, that's an unauthorized public performance. But what Aereo does is it has all these little mini antennas that are about the size of a dime, and it assigns to a subscriber one at a time on a rotating basis those antennas, and so it captures the signal and stores it in an individual assigned hard drive space of a DVR, and then sends it either almost in real time or sends it later. And under the Cablevision legal precedent, the court is saying, well, that's actually storage that Aereo isn't doing, that the subscriber is doing, and Aereo really isn't doing the copying, it's the subscriber that's doing the copying, and then that performance isn't really a public performance, it's a private performance, so it really doesn't count under copyright law. So in fact, now you have basically a competitor to normal cable and satellite services that are doing the same thing, retransmitting broadcast signals to subscribers, but instead of having to pay for a retransmission license that all cable and satellite operators do, Aereo doesn't, because they're not implicating anything under copyright. I mean, the dissenting judge just said this is like a total sham, and we think it is. So how do we get there? Well, I think we got there in the Cablevision case. I actually think it's a bad case. Betsy thinks it's a good case, but what I think Betsy is absolutely right. I think what the court was struggling there, it's like one of the things lawyers always say about bad facts make bad law. Cablevision was a licensed service, right? So Cablevision was allowed to rebroadcast these signals, have consumers have DVRs in the home, and I think the court was saying, come on, what's the difference? If the consumer can record the programming in the consumer's home, and now Cablevision is making it possible for the consumer to press the remote and have the recording in a locker assigned to that consumer at Cablevision's head end. What's the difference? You know, and you can see, you know, and I can see, as a practical matter, you think like, you can't let the law get in the way of that technological advance. It's really the same thing. It's the consumer just making a copy of licensed programming. The problem is the sort of legal fictions that the court came up with to arrive at that result, which was saying that, okay, the consumer's pressing the button, it's the consumer making the copy. Cablevision really isn't making the copy, even though Cablevision's clearly making the copy at its head end. And then saying, oh, and when the transmission goes back to the subscriber, even though Cablevision is sending it to the subscriber, that's not really a performance. And I think what the content companies were really concerned about wasn't so much about this DVR service at the head end, but what it could spawn in terms of area-like services, and it's come back to haunt us. Luckily, from our vantage point, there have been a couple of services that have started up that are area-like copycats that have been shut down in a federal court in Washington, D.C., and one in California. So the law is in a big state of flux here, but that's where we come out on it.
Jewel?
We don't have a view on the Aereo case or the Cablevision case. Aereo, because it's the Film-On cases, which Dean is referring to, and the other ones. There's a lot of cases out there, and there's sort of back and forth as to where they're going to go. And when you talk to developers of services like the ones we make, all of these cases aren't sort of either good or bad. They're just data as to what you can and can't do when you're building a service that you want to serve what you think the consumers would like to buy from you. What I'd like to do with Aereo, though, and to a certain extent Cablevision, is put it in a historical context that goes back even farther than when Richard started with the Betamax case. The roots of Aereo start in the hills of West Virginia in 1957. In 1957, in Clarksburg and Fairmont, West Virginia, and for those of you who've driven, like I have, from Morgantown to Huntington, you drive past both of those towns, people there could not get access to over-the-air broadcasts because they had hills and valleys, and a lot of the signals didn't go down to where they lived. So a company called Fortnightly started stringing an antenna at the tops of the hills and running the long wire that Betsy's talking down to the folks down in the holler who could actually, so they could actually watch the cable. They charged for it, $3 a month or something like that. It was a small amount. They were sued by copyright owners under the old 1909 Act as infringing their copyrights. And in two occasions, once with this Fortnightly company and once with a company called Teleprompter, the Supreme Court both times said that those were not infringing activities by stringing up those cables and running them to their subscribers. The litigation essentially delayed the passage of the 1976 Copyright Act because we were all sort of waiting for those cases. I was -2, but everyone was waiting to figure out what would happen in those cases. And in fact, the interesting thing is that the performance right that was enacted in 1976, which is what was interpreted in the Cablevision, was sort of designed to kind of avoid the result in the Fortnightly and Teleprompter cases, which it was drafted extremely broadly to say performance is sort of everything in the world, except for the things we specifically say it's not. And what the Cablevision case, somewhat I think surprising to people who've been in copyright, said, yeah, it sort of says it's everything in the world except for these specific things, and on its face it seems to cover what was going on in Cablevision. But just because what Cablevision seemed to be doing is so much like what people do with their VCRs, we're going to interpret it in a way that it doesn't apply. And I think you're going to see the same kind of back and forth with Aereo, which is, yes, it looks like retransmission in the same way that cable systems are retransmitting over-the-air broadcasts, but are we going to have the same kind of result that we had in the Fortnightly and Teleprompter cases in the 60s, which is, yes, but what's the real harm? Yes, but what isn't this? Shouldn't people, and I think this goes back to my original point, which was there's a very strong incentive on the part of individual consumers and the companies who want to serve them to get access to this information that everyone finds valuable, which is the over-the-air broadcasts and the stuff on their whole panoply of satellite and cable channels that they purchase but they can't watch it all times. You want to save it and watch it at different times. So you get the most value you can out of these services that you either pay for or that you're entitled to receive because they're broadcast to you over the air with advertising support. The question becomes, do the consumers get that right and ability to capture that value under the copyright law, or do you have to take that away from them in some respects and reserve it to the content owners? And that's sort of the push and pull that we see here. And there's a long, I think somewhat to the studio's dismay, there's something of a tradition in the courts, especially the Supreme Court, for the court to say, no, it really is the consumer's benefit that should be paramount here, and the studio's claim is therefore sort of rejected. And that's the way these cases, I think, the push and pull that come out, and that's why I think that's where the issue I raised, which is the consumer expectation and interference with what legitimately people think they should be legitimately allowed to do with these devices that they have, comes into play. And it's the statute can say one thing, the cases can even say one thing, but the courts can often go in different directions because of that. The last point I would make is the other important thing is, and I think this is the question for the sort of the studios and the cable systems and the ones who are sort of opposing the Aereo model, which is, so what's the alternative? What's the way for someone to get their local broadcast signals on their tablet device? What is the way to do it? And that's sort of the macro question about copyright and incentives. What incentives has copyright created to get that content that they could get if they plug the antenna in themselves? How can they get that to their device easily? Where are the alternatives? And to the extent there aren't alternatives, I think that will play in the way courts look at these questions. If it's being served in some way, and you can show that it's going to be directly competitive with a way that in an authorized way that's doing the job for the consumer, then you have the studios have a better chance of winning the case. If there's an absence there, the courts sometimes can feel compelled to try to make it happen through interpretations of the current Copyright Act.
Okay.
Just like to respond
Real quick,
to
because
that.
I want to
no,
save some
okay.
time for questions.
No,
But go ahead quickly.
I was just going to respond. I mean, I think in terms of the legitimate services, like all of the broadcast stations have their own ABC.com, CBS.com, NBC.com, where pretty much all of the programming is available within 24 hours after it's broadcast. So I think there are legitimate means to satisfy that. But what I did want to mention one thing about the Supreme Court is, just because technology can make content available to consumers in new ways, the Supreme Court always doesn't go and say, oh, well, that's just fine. And a recent Supreme Court case of a few years back was the Grokster decision from, I think, 2003, where on this peer-to-peer service, the court was saying, no, uploading files and encouraging copyrighted files to be uploaded to peer-to-peer services, that's copyright infringement. It doesn't matter that the technology makes it available to consumers and makes it available to consumers in new and convenient ways, it's still infringement. So I would not say that the Supreme Court always supports new technological forms of distribution that are unlicensed or unauthorized.
I think
So
just to weigh in on
Sure.
kind of the pro-Cablevision
Okay.
side, I think as history looks back, that is an extremely important decision for the cloud computing industry. So there was a study that came out of Harvard Business School where they found after that decision, it's similar to the DMCA safe harbors in that it's provided a legal certainty to new services that are coming up. So if you want to seek investment, if an investor is looking at you and they're saying, what's your legal liability, what's your risk? There's certain rules, if you comply with, you're a legal service, you can attract investment and go forward. And the rules that Cablevision kind of clarified were really important. That HBS study said something like, on a quarterly basis, investment in cloud services went up 41%, and they attributed kind of incrementally billions of dollars of additional investment in the cloud because of the certainty that case provided, not just for the Cablevision service, but for other services like that. We're at a point today where users they're storing lots of different types of content. So text, music, movies, they're storing that to the cloud. And they're using these services to be able to gain access to it and to be able to do things using cloud-based services that they could also otherwise do, on their own devices in their own home. So I think at this point it would wreak quite a good deal of havoc on a lot of these services if the idea that a service that's just transmitting, one copy back to one user, if that somehow is now becoming a public performance to trigger theories of infringement under copyright law, that would vastly change the way a lot of these services have now developed their systems to operate. And the Aereo case does introduce new facts, but with Cablevision, the kind of dichotomy between private performance, public performance did not hinge on whether Cablevision had licenses or not. That was kind of a separate analysis, and we similarly don't really we're not a party to the Aereo case, but if the concern is, an industry-specific issue with the legal regime for, how you transmit broadcast signals, there are other ways of addressing that specific issue. There's, a licensing regime that does not require massively changing, what is a public performance under U.S. copyright law.
Yeah, just to add one thing, Dean mentioned the Grokster and the Napster case, and I'm probably the least officially legal on this panel, but just to give some perspective on that, I believe the ruling was if it's primarily used to do copyright infringement, then the service is not allowed, and it was determined that Grokster and Napster were primarily being used for copyright infringement and were shut down. One last question, and then I want to open it up for a few minutes to questions. We're running short on time. One of the things that's happening that's making the acceleration of these services happen is getting these services to the television. So smart TVs, Samsung, LG, others are trying to build access to content directly into the television. There's third-party companies like Roku who sell a box that allow you to get internet stuff to your television. Recently, Google came out with a product called Chromecast for only $35, which allows you to stream Netflix and Hulu and anything that's in your Chrome browser wirelessly to your television. So I think that we're going to see an acceleration of these issues over the next year as they become more and more exciting to consumers, because now they can actually get this cloud content directly to their 60-inch big screen television and their tablets. So I just wanted to add that as some sort of context of what's happening in the market. That's interesting, but we should probably move to questions if there are any, because we have just a few minutes. So anybody have a question, just stand up and speak your piece.
If they could come forward and identify themselves.
If you could come forward and identify yourself. We're making it very official.
Well, while we're finding questioners, I want to pick up a little bit on what we've been saying here about the relationship between facts and law. So one question you could ask is, what's the difference between what Aereo is doing and what any individual is doing in their own home, getting a free service? And so maybe, to pick up on what Kay was saying, the change doesn't demand a legal change. Instead, it demands a business change, providing alternatives that maybe our moral intuition is different because it's a free service rather than a paid service in Cablevision, but moral intuition does not good law make.
Okay.
Hi, Chris Olson. You talked a lot about consumers' rights and content creators' rights, but what about the innovators or the entrepreneurs? In the kind of tech ecosystem, the belief is don't ask for permission, just beg for forgiveness. But they don't get into the business to make you guys' lives tough. They get into business to make great products or services. So with that, how can copyright not get in their way to hinder innovation for an entrepreneur when they don't have a ton of resources like great lawyers or a ton of money to pay for lawyers? How can they really continue to build great products, even though some of the use cases that their users may be using this service is a little bit of, infringes on copyright laws?
I'm really glad that you raised that, and I think as we're looking, what's been heartening is I think the number of people that have been interested in copyright law has really grown and expanded, and it includes a lot of innovators and startups, and that's excellent. And looking at, we talked also about copyright law with a goal of promoting and encouraging creativity. Well, similarly, you can look at, does this set of laws promote innovation? Does it help startups? Or does it make it more liable, does it increase their legal liability such that they won't even bother to create, the next Facebook or Google or Twitter? I think what we would say, I live in Washington, policy does make a big difference in terms of what's possible in the innovation context. And the U.S. law, the safe harbors, I think most VCs and new companies will say the DMCA safe harbors has been hugely important for allowing a YouTube to grow from a very small company that was, some college students to the company today that generates so much revenue for so many different people in the industry. And so that, the notion that you are not responsible for policing all of the content that somebody might put on your system, but if you're notified by a rights holder and they tell you what the legal status is, that you expeditiously remove that, that's something that even if you're a small company, you can say, I have the system in place, I know that I comply with that, and I can continue to operate. That's something that's really important, and we would like to see that same type of balance mirrored in other countries that haven't really yet built out their internet policy framework, because that's a really important piece. The flip side would be if you are liable for anything that a third party might put on your platform, so via a comment or their video or post. If you're liable for every single thing before you're notified as to the legal status, obviously that would really restrict what you can do. So I think that balance is generally the right one and something that's really worthwhile to protect for new services to develop.
Well, it may surprise you, but I generally agree with Katie. I mean, I think it's all about the balance. And so if you're developing, if you're innovating a service which is like, this is a great service to, it's something that's designed to, take movies, full-length movies, and distribute them to people all over the world, and that's what this is designed for, and that's what we're marketing it for. That's one thing. You're encouraging the infringement, you're inducing the infringement. That's sort of another principle from the Grokster case. That's going to get you in trouble. If you're making, a new sort of web service, like an application that people can, like YouTube, load video up, or a new editing tool that allows you to edit video much more easily. You're not going to be held liable for a new editing tool, even if some people use that editing tool in an infringing way. And so that was one of the very important principles.
Unless it has circumvention technologies.
Well, that's yes. If it's deleting encryption that's on commercial products, it could be a circumvention tool. You could be in trouble for that. But I think the notion of that was established in the Betamax case, the VCR case, of a staple article of commerce that has significant non-infringing uses, should really give lots of breathing room for innovators. But it doesn't give you a blank check if what you're really doing is trying to create a tool that is to be kind of commercially used to rip off content. And really, what I think is so critical about sort of the Grokster and the Napster decisions, it wasn't that peer-to-peer technology in and of itself was a bad thing. In fact, we distribute some of our content via peer-to-peer technology. It was that these companies were encouraging users upload all of this music, upload full copies of content. I mean, the old early days of YouTube with this ongoing litigation with Viacom. I mean, I think what their concern was that earlier YouTube was welcoming people to say upload full copies of television programming, and that's kind of a no-no, and that's crossing the line. And hopefully that shouldn't be too much of a an obstacle or a barrier, because innovation is incredibly important. And content companies, I mean, we need innovation, right? We use digital technology all the time in the creation and the dissemination of our works. So it's not good for us either if innovation comes to a halt.
There's another area that's getting a lot of attention, I think, in the policy space right now as well, which is statutory damages. So the Patent and Trademark Office has announced they're looking at this as an issue. I think Congress will as well. And that's another place where copyright has pretty strict regime. So that case against YouTube that Viacom filed, a company like a Google or YouTube can litigate a case like that for years. So even though we ultimately prevailed at every stage, if you're a new company and you get a complaint, and because of statutory damages, the bottom reads billions or trillions, that's going to be very chilling on the investment that you can incur. And so looking at those models and when is statutory damages really appropriate might be another place to help promote innovative
Yeah, I have
services.
some personal experience. I was an investor in a company called Scour back in the early to mid 90s, which had a Napster-like product called Scour Exchange. And we were sued for, I think it was $500 billion. And we ended up not being able to proceed with
Shocking,
the company.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
I want to keep to the schedule because everybody's busy. So I'm not going to ask any more questions. I'm just going to hand it over to John to wrap up.
So yeah, first of all, I'd like to give a hand to our panelists.